3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later. 5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later.
The next morning, later that night, the next evening, 1 operation later, 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning, later, 1 hour later, 7 months later, the next Christmas, several long days later, many toys later, 12 sleepless hours later, 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. The next morning, many frame building attempts later, even more boat building attempts later, 1 day later, 1 humongous meal later, 1 entree later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, several bouquets later,